It is the autumn of 1962, and Joan Kennedy is standing at the edge of a stage in Massachusetts. Her husband is at the microphone. The crowd is watching him. The voice, the jaw, the name. Joan stands slightly behind, and to the right, the precise distance a campaign photographer would have calculated. She is 26 years old. She is wearing a wool coat the color of winter wheat, and her posture is exact. She does not fidget. She does not scan the crowd. She looks at a point just past the audience, holding an expression that reads, from a distance, as pride. No one appears to be speaking to her. Later, in photographs from that afternoon, she appears in 3 of them. In 2, she is partially obscured by a shoulder, by a campaign sign. In the 3rd, she is fully visible, standing alone in the frame, while the men around her face another direction. She is smiling. The smile is accomplished. Joan Bennett Kennedy would spend the better part of 4 decades inside moments like this one, positioned carefully, observed selectively, and understood almost not at all. This is not a story about the Kennedy family, though the family is everywhere in it. It is not a story about alcoholism, though alcohol is present throughout. It is a story about a particular kind of disappearance, the kind that happens in public, slowly, in wool coats and good shoes, while a crowd watches something else entirely. What follows is not a rescue, and it is not an indictment. It is an attempt to look directly at what everyone around her spent decades looking past. Bronxville, New York sits 12 miles north of Manhattan, close enough to the city to draw its money, far enough to pretend it doesn't need it. In the 1940s and 1950s, it was one of the wealthiest municipalities in the United States, a village of Tudor facades, private clubs, and an unspoken agreement among its residents about who belonged and who did not. It was, for decades, openly restrictive. No black residents, very few Jewish families. The community maintained itself through architecture, through school enrollment, through the quiet mechanics of inclusion that never needed to be written down to function perfectly. Harry Wiggin Bennett moved his family there in the late 1940s. He was an advertising executive, successful, socially fluent, the kind of man who understood that environment was a form of argument. His wife, Virginia, was a former model of some local renown, and the combination of her appearance and his position gave the family a particular kind of standing in Bronxville, visible, admired, not quite at the center, but close enough to feel its warmth. Joan Virginia Bennett was born in 1936, the second of 2 daughters. From an early age, she was identified as the beautiful one. This is not a neutral fact. In a household shaped by appearances, a mother who had been professionally beautiful, a father who sold images for a living, to be called beautiful was to be assigned a function. Joan was tall, blonde, fine-featured in a way that photographed well, even in childhood. People said it often enough that it stopped being a compliment and became a description of what she was for. She attended the Manhattanville College of the Sacred Heart, a Catholic institution in Purchase, New York, chosen with the specific logic that governed such decisions in that world. It was respectable. It was contained. It produced a certain kind of educated woman, not a professional, not an intellectual. A woman who could speak at a dinner table, play an instrument, and move through formal settings without embarrassing her family. Joan studied music there, and by several accounts she was genuinely talented, her piano playing described by instructors as more than ornamental, more than the finishing school requirement it was meant to satisfy. This detail matters, and not because it is inspiring. It matters because it is one of the few places in Joan Bennett's early life where something belonged entirely to her. The music was not for display, not initially. It was private in a way that almost nothing else in her upbringing was permitted to be. She practiced alone. She improved through solitary repetition. Whatever she felt at the keyboard, she did not have to perform it for anyone. Outside the practice room, performance was the primary curriculum. Manhattanville in the 1950s ran on a social architecture as precise as anything in Bronxville. The girls, they were called girls, were trained in comportment, in conversation, in the management of their own desirability. There were rules about how to enter a room, how to refuse a drink, how to make a man feel he had said something interesting. Joan absorbed all of it with the ease of someone who had been absorbing versions of the same lesson since childhood. She was well liked. She was considered warm. She was elected to social committees and remembered fondly by classmates. who would later describe her in interviews using the same small cluster of words: sweet, lovely, gracious. Words that describe a surface. It was at Manhattanville that she met Ethel Skakel, who would become Ethel Kennedy. This is where the gravitational pull begins, not with Ted Kennedy, not with a romance, but with a social proximity that narrowed the distance between Joan Bennett and the Kennedy orbit in a way that felt, at the time, like good fortune. The meeting happened through Ethel first. Joan was 2 years younger, an underclassman, and the Kennedy connection was already socially significant by the mid-1950s. Joseph Kennedy Sr. had seen to that, had spent years and considerable money constructing a family identity that was simultaneously Irish Catholic and aspirationally aristocratic, rooted in Boston, but reaching toward Washington. By the time Joan Bennett was at Manhattanville, to know a Kennedy was to occupy a slightly elevated position in the social geography of Catholic East Coast society. It was not subtle, and it was not accidental. Harry Bennett met Ted Kennedy through a series of social intersections that biographers have traced, but that Joan herself later described with characteristic vagueness: a meeting, a party, a summer event. What is documented is that Harry Bennett invited Ted Kennedy to a function, that Ted came, and that Joan was present. She was 21, he was 25. He told her she was beautiful. Given that she had heard this her entire life from people trying to tell her something useful about herself, it is worth noting how little this distinguished him. What distinguished the Kennedy family was something else, a force of collective identity so strong that proximity to it felt like elevation. Joan would later say, in interviews conducted decades after the marriage had ended, that she had been starstruck, not by Ted specifically, by the idea of the family, by what it seemed to mean to be part of something that large and that certain of itself. Harry Bennett approved of the match with a speed that suggested he had been waiting for something like it. Virginia Bennett's feelings are less documented. What is recorded is that the engagement was announced in November 1957 and that the wedding date was set for the following year, moving with the efficiency of something that had already been decided at a level above the two people most directly involved. Joan Bennett was 22 years old when the engagement was announced. She had completed her degree. She played piano well enough to have pursued it seriously. She had grown up in a household that prized appearances, attended an institution that refined them, and emerged as exactly what both had intended to produce: poised, pleasant, beautiful, and now, through the mechanics of a well-managed social world, positioned at the edge of one of the most powerful families in American political life. She described the period between the engagement and the wedding as exciting. She used that word in multiple interviews across multiple decades. Exciting. A word that contains almost no information about what a person actually felt, and that Joan Bennett Kennedy would return to again and again throughout her life when asked to describe moments that, examined closely, were something else entirely. Zero. The ceremony took place on November 29, 1958, at St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Church in Bronxville. It was a Saturday. The weather was cold and gray in the particular way that late November in New York manages. Not dramatically, just persistently, the kind of cold that makes everything feel slightly effortful. There were 500 guests inside the church. Outside, a small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, not because they knew Joan Bennett, but because they knew the name she was about to take. The dress was white satin, full-skirted, with a cathedral train that required 2 attendants to manage. There were 13 bridesmaids. The flowers were white chrysanthemums. These details were reported in the society pages of several newspapers the following day, described with the careful inventory that society journalism applied to such events, as though the wedding were a room being appraised rather than a moment being witnessed. The New York Times ran a photograph. Joan is centered in it, veil lifted, bouquet held at the correct angle. She looks exactly as she was supposed to look. Ted Kennedy's father, Joseph Kennedy Sr., was present and visibly satisfied. This is documented not through sentiment, but through the accounts of several guests who noted his mood that afternoon. Expansive, proprietary, the mood of a man watching an investment mature. Joseph Kennedy had spent decades engineering the family's social position with the deliberateness of a construction project, and a new addition who was blonde, Catholic, well-bred, and photogenic fit the specifications precisely. He had, by multiple accounts, approved of Joan before Ted had fully decided on her. This sequencing was not considered unusual by anyone in the room. Ted's brothers were there, Jack, then a senator from Massachusetts 2 years from his own presidential campaign, and Bobby, already operating as a figure of significant political weight. The Kennedy women, Rose, Ethel, Jean, Pat, Eunice, arrived with the collective force of a group that had long since established its own internal hierarchy and had no particular reason to adjust it for a newcomer. Joan would later describe feeling at her own wedding reception like a guest who had arrived without quite understanding the occasion. She did not use those words. She said she remembered feeling a little overwhelmed. The translation is not difficult. The reception was held at the Bronxville Women's Club, a venue Harry Bennett had booked with the understanding that the Kennedy family's preferences would naturally take precedence over his own. This was correct. The guest list had been negotiated, that is the accurate word, with Joseph Kennedy's office involved in the final count. People Joan's parents had expected to invite did not receive invitations. People the Kennedys required to be present were added without consultation. Harry Bennett accepted this with the pragmatic grace of a man who understood that he had reached the outer limit of his own social leverage and that the correct response was accommodation. Joan danced with her father early in the evening. By several accounts, this was the moment she cried. Briefly, privately, her face turned toward his shoulder. No one appears to have remarked on it publicly at the time. It appears in a single memoir written decades later by a family friend, mentioned in passing, as though it were a detail of minor significance. A young woman crying at her own wedding briefly while dancing with her father was not the kind of thing that required examination in 1958. What the marriage represented practically was a transfer. Joan Bennett had been produced by one careful social environment and was now being absorbed into a larger and more demanding one. The Bennett household had shaped her into a certain kind of woman. The Kennedy family would now determine what that woman was for. This was not a transaction anyone named. It did not need to be named to function. Ted Kennedy was 26 years old and had, by the standards of his family and his time, done nothing yet. Jack was the senator. Bobby was the operative. Ted was the youngest, the least serious. The one Joseph Sr. had enrolled at Harvard after a cheating incident required a 2-year absence and a careful re-enrollment strategy. He was charming in the specific Kennedy way. Physically confident, socially effortless, capable of making a room feel warmer by entering it. He was also, by the accounts of people who knew him well during this period, not particularly interested in the interior life of the woman he had just married. This is not presented as condemnation. It is a description of a man who had been raised inside a family where women managed households, managed appearances, and managed emotions, their own and everyone else's, while men accumulated power and moved through the world with the assumption that their needs were the organizing principle of any given situation. Ted Kennedy had been marinated in this from birth. Joan Bennett had been prepared by her own upbringing to accommodate exactly this kind of man. The fit was structural. They honeymooned in Europe. Joan later described it as lovely. Lovely is another of her words. Smooth, pleasant, revealing almost nothing. What is documented from that period is that Ted was frequently distracted, socially restless in a way that honeymoons are not generally designed to accommodate, and that Joan, within the first weeks of the marriage, began the pattern that would define the next 2 decades. Arranging herself around his energy, filling the silences he left, performing contentment with enough consistency that it eventually became difficult to locate where the performance ended. They returned to Massachusetts and moved into a house in the Boston suburb of Brookline. Joan furnished it. She learned the rhythms of Ted's schedule, his preferences, the names of his associates. She attended the functions she was required to attend. She wrote the thank you notes. She appeared in the photographs. She did all of this with the competence of someone who had been trained for exactly this role, which she had been, and with a growing private awareness that competence and satisfaction are not the same condition, which no one had trained her for at all. The chrysanthemums from the ceremony were dried and kept for a time, then discarded. The cathedral train was folded into a box. The society page photograph yellowed in the way that newsprint does, gradually, without announcement, until the image becomes harder to read than it once was. Hyannisport in summer operates on its own logic. The Kennedy compound, 3 houses on Nantucket Sound, connected by lawn and habit, was not a vacation destination for the family, so much as a gravitational center. It was where the Kennedys became most fully themselves, competitive, loud, physically relentless, organized around a set of internal rules that outsiders were expected to absorb without being taught. Touch football on the lawn, sailing in weather that discouraged it, meals taken at specific times, conversation dominated by politics and performance, the implicit understanding that softness was a form of failure. Joan arrived into this environment in the summer of 1959, the first full summer of her marriage, and found that nothing in Bronxville or Manhattanville had prepared her for it in any practical sense. The Kennedy women were the first difficulty, not through cruelty. Cruelty would have been easier to name, and therefore easier to navigate. The difficulty was more ambient than that. Ethel Kennedy, who had married Bobby in 1950 and had been absorbing the compound's rhythms for nearly a decade by the time Joan arrived, moved through Hyannisport with the authority of someone who had already passed whatever test the place administered. She was loud where Joan was quiet, physical where Joan was careful, seemingly impervious to the emotional weather that Joan found exhausting. Eunice Kennedy Shriver was formidable in a different register. Intellectually aggressive, politically engaged, operating on a frequency of intensity that made casual conversation feel like an inadequate response. Jean and Pat Kennedy were less dominant but no less defined, their personalities already calcified into recognizable shapes that the family had long since stopped examining. Joan was blonde and gentle and had been raised to smooth situations rather than charge through them. At the compound, smoothness read as absence. Rose Kennedy was a separate matter entirely. She presided over the family with a combination of Catholic discipline and emotional distance that her children had long since internalized as normal. She had survived the death of a son in the war, the lobotomy of a daughter whose condition had been hidden from the public for decades, the assassination of another son still years away, but already somehow implicit in the atmosphere of Kennedy life. The sense that the family moved at a speed that generated its own casualties. Rose was not unkind to Joan. She was correct with her, which in its own way was more alienating than unkindness would have been. Correct suggested a standard being applied. Joan was being measured against something she had not been shown. The physical demands of compound life were not trivial. The touch football games on the lawn were not optional in any meaningful sense. Participation was a form of loyalty declaration, and the games were played with a seriousness that occasionally produced injuries and was never permitted to produce complaint. Joan played. She was athletic enough, coordinated enough, but she played with the awareness of someone who understood that the game was also an audition, which made the playing different from what everyone else appeared to be doing. When she was hit hard and went down on the grass one afternoon in that first summer, the accounts are imprecise about exactly when. She got up quickly. Getting up quickly was the only acceptable response. Someone, possibly Ted, possibly one of the brothers, said something that passed for encouragement. The game continued. Sailing was another arena. The Kennedys sailed with competitive intent, in boats that required actual skill, in conditions that Joseph Sr. had always believed should be somewhat adverse. Joan was not an experienced sailor. She learned because not learning was not a position the compound permitted. She learned in the particular way that people learn things under social pressure. Adequately, joylessly, with the persistent awareness that her adequacy was being assessed by people for whom the activity was native. What the compound was, functionally, was a machine for producing a certain kind of Kennedy. It had worked on the siblings across decades of summer immersion. It was not designed to work on a person arriving fully formed at 23, carrying a different upbringing, a different set of instincts, a different interior register entirely. Joan understood this without being able to articulate it. She would say in later interviews that she had always felt she had to try harder there, that she was always a little nervous. She said this mildly, the way she said most things that were not mild at all. Ted Kennedy at the compound was a different version of Ted Kennedy in Brookline. He expanded in the family's presence, became louder and more physical, orbited his brothers with the energy of someone who still needed their approval at a level he was too old to acknowledge. Joan contracted slightly in direct proportion. This was not a dynamic either of them examined. It simply occurred summer after summer in the salt air and the sound of a family that had decided what it was and had no mechanism for incorporating doubt. By the early 1960s, with Jack in the White House and the Kennedy name carrying a weight it had never carried before, the compound in summer became something additional, a staging ground for a kind of celebrity that had no precedent in American political life. Journalists, photographers, the motorcades visible from the water. Joan moved through all of it with the composed expression she had been developing since childhood, the one that read as poise from a distance and from closer proximity revealed almost nothing. There were moments, documented in letters Joan wrote to friends during this period, some of which surfaced in later biographical research, where she described Hyannisport with a careful, qualified warmth that reads now as the warmth of someone trying to convince herself. She wrote about the beauty of the water. She wrote about dinners being lively. She did not write in any letter that has been recovered about feeling at home there. The house assigned to Ted and Joan on the compound was the smallest of the three main structures. This was a function of seniority. Jack's family had the main house, the others arranged around it by their position in the family's internal order. Joan decorated her portion of it with the same quiet competence she brought to the Brookline house. She hung curtains, she arranged furniture, she made a space that looked inhabited. Whether it felt that way is a different question, and not one the compound's logic provided space to ask. The first miscarriage happened in 1959, within the first year of the marriage. It was not reported publicly. In the social and medical culture of the late 1950s, miscarriage was managed as a private medical event. Something that happened to women was handled by their doctors and was not discussed in the vocabulary of grief. It was discussed, if at all, in the vocabulary of health. A complication, a setback, something to recover from physically so that the correct outcome could be attempted again. The emotional content of the experience was not part of the available language, and Joan, who had been raised in a household that prized composure and married into a family that treated vulnerability as a structural weakness, had no framework within which to process what had happened to her as a loss. She was 23 years old. She had been married less than a year. Ted was already moving at the pace his family required. The law degree from the University of Virginia. The early positioning for a political career that Joseph Sr. had been engineering since before the marriage. The household in Brookline continued to function. Joan continued to function inside it. The miscarriage was absorbed into the ongoing business of a Kennedy life the way most things that happened to Joan were absorbed, quietly, without ceremony, without adequate acknowledgement. Joan Kennedy was born in February 1960. The pregnancy had been managed with the Kennedy family's characteristic attention to public presentation. Joan's health monitored, her appearances calibrated, the birth announced with the appropriate combination of warmth and brevity that the family's press operation had by then perfected. Kara was healthy. Joan recovered. The narrative, to the extent there was one, was straightforward. A young political family, growing appropriately, moving forward. Edward Moore Kennedy Jr. was born in September 1961. By this point, Ted was campaigning for the Massachusetts Senate seat. He would win in 1962, running to occupy the chair his brother Jack had vacated for the White House. The campaign made specific use of Joan. Her appearance, her composure, her ability to stand beside her husband and project the image of a stable and attractive family unit. She was 25, the mother of 2 children under 2, and she was being deployed at campaign events with a regularity that did not pause for the physical reality of what her body had recently undergone. She appeared. She smiled. She wore the right clothes. The crowds responded to her warmly, which the campaign noted and continued to exploit. The second miscarriage came in 1963. This one also went publicly unacknowledged. What is documented is that it occurred during a period of extraordinary external pressure. Jack Kennedy was in the White House. The family was operating at a level of public exposure it had never previously experienced, and Ted's Senate career was 3 months old. The domestic interior of Joan's life in this period is sparsely documented precisely because it was not considered the relevant story. What was relevant was the Senate. What was relevant was the White House. What was happening inside Joan Kennedy's body, and whatever she felt about it was managed, as before, as a private medical matter. Patrick Joseph Kennedy was born in July 1963. He was the third child in 3.5 years of marriage. Joan was 26. 3 children, 2 miscarriages, a Senate campaign, a husband whose public career was accelerating at a rate that made personal attention an increasingly scarce resource, and a family compound that had established its expectations clearly enough that deviation from them was not a practical option. What is striking, reviewing the documentary record of these years, is how thoroughly Joan's physical experience is absent from it. The political record of Ted's early Senate career is extensive. The public record of the Kennedy family during the White House years is enormous. Joan appears in photographs from this period in the expected configuration. Beside Ted at events, with children at appropriate moments, in clothes that read as appropriate for whichever occasion was being documented. The miscarriages do not appear anywhere in the public record. The exhaustion does not appear. The accumulating weight of a body that had been through 5 pregnancies in 4 years, while its owner was required to maintain a public face of composed and attractive political wifehood, does not appear. In November 1963, Jack Kennedy was shot in Dallas. Joan was at home in Virginia, where the family had moved to accommodate Ted's Senate work. She learned what had happened the way most Americans did, through the television, suddenly, without preparation. What followed for the Kennedy family was a period of grief so public and so total that it consumed everything around it. Rose Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy, the funeral, the eternal flame, the country's mourning, orchestrated and genuine simultaneously, surrounding the family like weather. Joan's grief in this period is not documented in any detail. She was present at the required moments. She appeared at the funeral with the composed expression that the occasion demanded, and that she had been developing for years. What she felt privately, how the assassination registered inside a woman who had spent 4 years learning to suppress her interior life in deference to the Kennedy family's external requirements, is not recorded. The grief that was recorded, photographed, and preserved for history was Jackie's. Joan stood in the background of those images, as she stood in the background of most images, present and largely unexamined. The third miscarriage came in 1966. By this point, the marriage was 3 years past the assassination. Ted was established in the Senate, and the family had reorganized itself around Bobby's emerging presidential ambitions. Joan had 3 children between the ages of 3 and 6. She had miscarried 3 times. She had attended more campaign events, state dinners, family gatherings, and public appearances than could be easily counted, performing at each of them the role she had been selected and trained to perform. She told an interviewer years later that the miscarriages had been very hard. She said it the way she said most things that were very hard. Briefly, evenly, with the adjective doing work that the sentence structure did not support. Very hard. 2 words standing in for something that had no adequate language in the vocabulary she had been given, in the family she had married into, in the era that had shaped her. The children grew. Ted's career continued. The household functioned. The first documented reference to Joan Kennedy's drinking appears in the mid-1960s in the account of a family friend who noted, with the careful imprecision that characterized how people discussed such things in that era, that Joan had seemed not quite herself at a gathering. Not quite herself. A phrase that contains its own evasion, implying a self that existed and was being departed from, without specifying what the departure looked like or what had caused it. What the historical record makes clear, assembled from the accounts of people who were present during this period, is that the drinking did not arrive suddenly. It developed the way most things developed in Joan Kennedy's life. Gradually, without announcement, in the private spaces that her public role left available. The mid-1960s were, by any external measure, a period of accumulating pressure. Ted's Senate career was demanding in ways that distributed their weight unevenly across the marriage. He was in Washington during the week, frequently longer. Joan was in the family's Virginia home, then increasingly at the house in McLean, managing 3 children under school age with the help of household staff while navigating the social obligations of a Senate wife. The dinners, the functions, the appearances that required her to be presentable and pleasant and politically useful on schedules that did not consult her own. The loneliness of this arrangement was structural. It was built into the geography of the life they were living. Ted Kennedy's infidelities during this period are documented extensively in the biographies that followed decades later, less extensively in the contemporary record, and almost not at all in what Joan was permitted to say publicly at the time. What is known is that the affairs were not discreet or carefully concealed, so much as they were conducted with the ease of a man who understood that his environment would absorb them. The Kennedy social world, the operatives, the family loyalists, the journalists who maintained their access by maintaining their silence, functioned as a kind of insulation. Information moved around Joan rather than toward her, and when it arrived through the particular cruelty of social indirection. A look held a moment too long at a party, a name mentioned with a casualness that was not casual. The geography of a room rearranging itself around something she had not been told. She knew. This is not speculative. Joan Kennedy said in interviews conducted after the divorce that she had known about the affairs and that knowing had been its own particular kind of isolation, information she could not act on publicly, could not discuss within the family structure that surrounded her, and could not make sense of through any framework her upbringing had provided. She had been raised Catholic, married in a Catholic church, and absorbed into a family whose public identity was inseparable from its Catholicism. Divorce was not a visible option. Confrontation within the Kennedy family's emotional culture was not a mechanism that existed for wives. What existed was endurance, performed as contentment. Alcohol, in this context, was not an escape so much as a management tool, a way of reducing the ambient pressure of a life that required constant performance while providing almost no private space for whatever was actually felt. This is not a clinical description. It is a practical one, drawn from what Joan herself said about the function drinking served in those years. She described it later as something that helped her get through things. Get through. The phrase implies an obstacle being navigated rather than a life being lived. The drinking was initially socially invisible. This was partly a function of context. Alcohol was the connective tissue of the political and social world Joan inhabited. Cocktail parties, Senate receptions, family dinners at the compound where the bar was available, and its use unremarkable. A woman drinking in these settings was not a woman doing something conspicuous. The line between social drinking and something else was not clearly drawn in that world, which made it easier to cross without anyone, including Joan herself, being required to name what was happening. The Kennedy family's response to Joan's drinking, as it became more visible through the late 1960s, is one of the more documented failures of the period, documented not in real time, but in retrospect, through the accounts of people who acknowledged years later that they had seen what was happening and had not addressed it. The reasons given vary. Some accounts suggest the family genuinely did not understand addiction as a medical condition in the way it would come to be understood later. Others suggest a more uncomfortable calculus, that Joan's drinking was a problem that existed in the private sphere, and the Kennedy family's considerable resources were organized around managing the public sphere. What happened inside the McLean house was inside the McLean house. Ted Kennedy's direct response to his wife's alcoholism during these years is the hardest to reconstruct, because it was largely not reconstructed by him. He gave few detailed accounts of this period as it pertained to Joan. What emerges from the available record is a picture of a man who was increasingly absent, who understood on some level what was happening at home and did not alter the conditions that were contributing to it, and who managed the situation with the same tool the Kennedy family applied to most uncomfortable domestic realities. Discretion, which in practice meant silence, which in practice meant that Joan Kennedy was left largely alone with what was happening to her. There were during this period brief intervals of sobriety. Joan would stop drinking for weeks or months, the effort visible to those close to her, and then something, a campaign season, a family crisis, another public appearance requiring her to perform a version of herself she found increasingly difficult to locate, would collapse the interval. The pattern established itself in the mid-1960s and did not release her for decades. In 1967, Bobby Kennedy announced his intention to seek the Democratic presidential nomination. The family reorganized itself around this new campaign, and Joan was again positioned as a supporting figure in a political enterprise she had not chosen and was not consulted about. She appeared at events. She wore the right clothes. She stood at the correct distance from the microphone. The drinking continued in the hours before and after. On the evening of July 18, 1969, Ted Kennedy drove a car off a narrow wooden bridge on Chappaquiddick Island, Massachusetts. The passenger was Mary Jo Kopechne, a 28-year-old former campaign worker for Bobby Kennedy, who had been assassinated 13 months earlier. Ted Kennedy survived. Mary Jo Kopechne did not. Her body was recovered from the submerged vehicle the following morning. Ted Kennedy did not report the accident to authorities until the next day, approximately 10 hours after it occurred. Joan Kennedy was not on Chappaquiddick Island that night. She was at the family's home in Hyannisport, pregnant with her fourth child. The gap between those two facts, her husband on an island with a young woman, her body carrying a child, the hours between the accident and the phone call she eventually received, is not a gap the historical record fills with any detail about Joan's interior experience. What the record fills it with is the political crisis management that began almost immediately. The Kennedy lawyers, the advisors, the carefully worded public statement, the legal strategy, the question of how to contain the damage to Ted's political future. Joan miscarried shortly after Chappaquiddick. The timing is documented. The connection between the catastrophic stress of those weeks and the pregnancy's end was not discussed publicly, was not linked in any official statement, and was absorbed into the ongoing management of a situation in which Joan's physical and emotional experience was the least visible element. What was required of her in the weeks following the accident was performance of a very specific kind. Ted Kennedy pleaded guilty to leaving the scene of an accident and received a suspended sentence. He delivered a televised address to Massachusetts on July 25, 1969, 7 days after the accident, in which he described his actions, expressed remorse, and asked his constituents whether they wished him to remain in the Senate. Joan sat beside him in the frame of the public photographs taken in the days surrounding this address. She appeared at his side at the necessary moments, composed, supportive in posture, if not necessarily in fact, wearing the expression that had become her primary public instrument. The decision about what expression to wear, what to say if asked, how to position her body in relation to her husband during the most publicly scrutinized period of his career, these decisions were not entirely Joan's. The accounts of Kennedy advisors from this period describe a deliberate strategy in which Joan's visible loyalty was considered essential to Ted's political survival. Her presence beside him was not incidental. It was calculated. She was, in the language the political operatives did not use, but the logic of their decisions made clear, a prop in a survival narrative that required a devoted wife in the frame. Whether Joan was consulted about this role, whether she agreed to it through genuine choice or through the accumulated pressure of a marriage and a family structure that had never offered her a meaningful alternative, these questions were not asked publicly at the time and were answered only partially much later in interviews Joan gave when the marriage was already over. She said she had wanted to support Ted. She said the family had told her it was important. She said she had not felt she could do otherwise. These three statements do not entirely resolve into one another, and the space between them is where the most honest account of that period probably lives. Mary Jo Kopechne's family received a private settlement. The specific terms were not disclosed. Her parents said in the limited interviews they gave that they had not received an adequate explanation of what had happened on that bridge. The Kopechne family's experience of the aftermath, their daughter's death managed as a political problem, their grief processed through lawyers and settlements while the man responsible for the accident continued his Senate career, exists at the edge of the Chappaquiddick story as it is usually told, which centers on Ted's political survival and the question of what it cost him. What it cost Joan is a separate accounting. The miscarriage, her fourth pregnancy lost, came in the middle of a period when she was being publicly deployed as evidence of her husband's domestic normalcy. Her body was failing a pregnancy while her face was being used to stabilize a political career. This simultaneity was not remarked upon by anyone managing the situation. It was not the relevant story. Ted Kennedy announced in late 1969 that he would not seek the presidency in 1972. This was widely understood as a direct consequence of Chappaquiddick, that the accident had made a presidential campaign politically impossible, at least for the foreseeable future. Within the family, within the political operation that surrounded Ted, this represented a significant recalibration. For Joan, it meant that the campaign, the public performances, the appearances, the sustained deployment of her image would contract, at least temporarily. This was not relief so much as a change in the specific nature of what was required. The marriage after Chappaquiddick was a different institution from the marriage before it, though it continued under the same name and the same roof for another 13 years. Joan said later that something had shifted permanently. She did not specify what, and it is possible she could not, because the shift was not a single thing but an accumulation of what she had been required to do in those weeks, of what had not been asked of her or offered to her, of the specific clarity that comes from watching yourself be managed at the moment when you had most needed something else entirely. The drinking, which had been escalating through the late 1960s, did not slow after Chappaquiddick. The accounts of people close to Joan during this period describe a woman who was increasingly difficult to reach, not hostile, not dramatic, but absent in the specific way that alcohol produces, present in the room and inaccessible within it. The bridge at Chappaquiddick was repaired. The political operation continued. Ted Kennedy was re-elected to the Senate in 1970 with a substantial majority. Joan appeared at the victory celebration in the appropriate configuration, beside him, smiling, wearing the expression that had become indistinguishable from her face. The 1970 Senate re-election campaign began its public phase in the spring of that year, and within the Kennedy political operation, a specific decision had been made about Joan. She would be more visible, not less. The logic was straightforward in the way that political logic tends to be. Chappaquiddick had produced a credibility problem, and a credibility problem of that particular kind, involving a young woman, a bridge, a night unaccounted for, required a counterweight. The counterweight was Joan. Her presence beside Ted was not incidental to the campaign. It was, in the assessment of the people running it, load-bearing. She was given preparation. This is documented in the accounts of campaign staff from that period. Joan was coached on what to say to journalists who approached her, how to redirect questions about Chappaquiddick toward Ted's Senate record, how to discuss her marriage in terms that conveyed stability without inviting scrutiny. She was given specific phrases. She was told which subjects to approach and which to move away from. She received this instruction with the compliance of someone who had spent 12 years learning that the Kennedy operation knew what it needed and that her role was to provide it. What the campaign required her to say in the interviews she gave during this period was that she believed in her husband. She said it. She said it in the particular register that she had developed for such statements. Warm but not effusive, direct but not emphatic, the register of a woman who has thought carefully about what she is saying rather than a woman who is reciting. It was a skilled performance, and it was received as genuine by the journalists who interviewed her, most of whom were not looking for the seam between the performance and the person behind it. The Massachusetts Press Corps of 1970 was not, by and large, interested in Joan Kennedy's interior experience. They were interested in Ted's political survival, which was the dominant story, and in Joan's function within that story, which was to be supportive. She was supportive. The interviews from this period describe her as poised, devoted, and forthcoming in a way that produced quotable warmth without revealing anything that could complicate the narrative being managed. There was one interview given to a women's magazine in the spring of 1970 that came closer to something unmanaged. The journalist noted in her published piece that Joan had paused at one point during their conversation, a pause that lasted long enough to register, before answering a question about whether she was happy. The answer Joan gave was affirmative. The pause was mentioned in the article without further comment, the journalist apparently uncertain what to do with it, and the piece ran with the warmth and stability the campaign would have approved of. But the pause is there in the published text, a small gap in the performance, visible to anyone reading carefully enough. She campaigned across Massachusetts through the summer and autumn. She appeared at county fairs, at union halls, at Democratic Party dinners in the western part of the state where the Kennedy name carried weight but required in-person reinforcement. She shook hands. She remembered names with the practiced recall of someone who had been doing this for nearly a decade. She spoke, when required to speak, in the moderate and pleasant register that the campaign had calibrated for her. She did not deviate from the script in any way that became publicly documented. What is documented through the accounts of campaign staff and family members speaking retrospectively is what happened in the hours surrounding these appearances. Joan was drinking before events, not always, not identifiably to audiences, but with enough regularity that the people managing her schedule were aware of it and had begun building accommodations into the logistics. A trusted aide would be present, a private car rather than a shared vehicle. Arrival times calibrated to allow for variables that were not written into the official schedule. The operation adapted to her condition the way it adapted to other logistical complications. Efficiently, without acknowledgement, absorbing the problem into the machinery. Ted Kennedy won the 1970 election with 62% of the vote. Joan appeared at the victory celebration at the Statler Hilton in Boston in the appropriate configuration. She stood beside her husband while he spoke. The crowd was loud and warm and directed entirely at him. She held her expression, the accomplished smile, the composed posture, the gaze pointed at a middle distance, with the consistency that 12 years of practice had made nearly automatic. In the years between 1970 and the beginning of Ted's presidential campaign in 1979, Joan's life settled into a pattern that was less dramatic than Chappaquiddick and more corrosive in the specific way that the ordinary can be. Ted was in Washington. Joan was increasingly in McLean, then increasingly in Boston, where she had begun spending time that was not accounted for by family obligations or campaign requirements. The children were in school. The household staff managed the domestic mechanics. Joan moved through the days with a freedom that was, in practice, a form of abandonment. Unscheduled, unwatched, without the structure that the campaign years had imposed. She enrolled at the New England Conservatory of Music in Boston in the mid-1970s, pursuing the music that had been hers alone since college. The enrollment was genuine. She attended classes, practiced seriously, worked toward a degree that she would eventually complete. People who knew her during this period described a version of Joan that was different from the campaign wife, more present, more animated, more recognizable as a person with a specific interior life. The music did what it had always done for her, which was to create a space that the Kennedy operation had no claim on. But the conservatory was a few hours in a week, and the week was long. The drinking continued in the hours the music did not fill, and the hours the music did not fill were the majority. Joan was arrested for drunk driving in Virginia in the mid-1970s. The incident was managed quietly, as such incidents involving prominent political families were managed in that era, with minimal public documentation and no apparent consequence to Ted's political standing. The arrest did not produce an intervention. It did not produce a conversation, at least not one that Joan later described as meaningful. It was absorbed, like most things that happened to her, into the ongoing management of a situation that everyone around her had tacitly agreed not to name. The house in McLean, Virginia was large in the way that houses in that particular Washington suburb tend to be. Substantial without being ostentatious, set back from the road on a property that communicated success through acreage rather than architecture. It had been selected with the practical logic of a Senate family. Proximity to Washington, good schools, thus the kind of neighborhood where the neighbors understood discretion as a social value rather than a personal preference. Inside it, through the mid to late 1970s, Joan Kennedy lived a life that was increasingly difficult to observe from the outside and increasingly difficult to sustain from within. Ted was in Washington during the week. This was not unusual for a Senate family and was not presented as unusual. It was the structural reality of the life they had chosen, or that had been chosen around them, and it produced the domestic arrangement that arrangement always produces. A woman managing a household largely alone while her husband's career generated the income, the social position, and the public identity that defined them both. Joan managed the household with the staff available to her, which was considerable. There were people to cook, to clean, to drive the children. The material requirements of daily life were not Joan's burden. What was her burden was the hours. Kara was a teenager by the mid-1970s, navigating the specific difficulties of adolescence inside a family, whose name generated its own complications, the expectations, the public attention, the weight of a legacy that had been built on the bodies of people who had not survived it. Teddy Jr. had been diagnosed with bone cancer in 1973 at the age of 12. The cancer required the amputation of his right leg. Joan was present through the treatment, through the surgery, through the rehabilitation. And this period represents one of the few documented instances where her presence as a mother is recorded in something other than the language of public appearance. People who observed her with Teddy Jr. during his illness described her as genuinely engaged, frightened in the way that parents are frightened, present in a way that her public life rarely required or permitted. The illness also coincided with a period of heavier drinking. These two facts do not cancel each other out. They existed simultaneously, the genuine maternal terror of a child's cancer diagnosis, and the escalating use of alcohol as the mechanism for managing a terror that had no other outlet in the structure of her life. Joan later said that Teddy's illness had been the hardest thing she had ever been through. The drinking during that period she described in the careful retrospective language she developed for discussing such things as something that had gotten away from her. Patrick, the youngest, was a child through these years, sensitive, asthmatic, already showing the signs of the anxiety that would shape his adult life and eventually lead him to his own public reckoning with addiction. The household in McLean was not a stable environment for a child with Patrick's particular nervous system, and the instability was not the kind that announces itself dramatically. It was the instability of a mother whose presence was inconsistent, whose capacity varied day to day in ways that a child registers without being able to name, whose love was genuine and whose availability was not. Joan's hospitalizations began in this period. The first was in 1974. A stay at a facility that was described publicly, to the extent it was described at all, in the vague language of exhaustion and rest. The Kennedy operations management of this information was efficient. Minimal disclosure, no official statement, the matter handled as a private health issue. This was accurate in the narrow sense that it was indeed a health issue, and the privacy was indeed maintained. What it was not was adequate. As a response to what was happening to Joan, as a form of care, as anything other than a strategy for containing damage to the family's public image. She returned from the hospitalization to the McLean house. The conditions that had produced the crisis, the isolation, the irregular schedule, the marriage that existed primarily as a public institution, the absence of any sustained therapeutic support, were not materially changed. She was sober for a period. Then she was not. There were, during these years, social appearances that the historical record preserves in photographs, state dinners, Senate functions. The occasional Kennedy family gathering at Hyannis Port, where Joan continued to appear and continued to contract slightly in the presence of the family's collective force. In the photographs from this period, she looks to a careful eye different from the photographs of the early 1960s, something in the quality of the composure, a slight effortfulness that the earlier images did not contain. The expression is the same. The work required to maintain it is more visible. Ted's relationship with Joan during this period is described by the people close to both of them in terms that converge on a single quality: inattention. Not hostility, not cruelty in any active sense, but the specific form of harm that sustained inattention produces. The accumulated message delivered through absence and distraction that a person's condition is not the primary concern of the people best positioned to address it. Ted was not indifferent in the way that indifference is performed. He was indifferent in the structural way. His attention organized around his career, his political relationships, his own appetites, with Joan existing at the periphery of that organization in a position that was acknowledged when useful and neglected when not. A second hospitalization followed in the late 1970s. Again, the details were managed carefully. Again, Joan returned to conditions that had not substantially changed. The pattern, crisis, treatment, return, recurrence, was by this point established clearly enough that the people around her could see it, and the absence of any sustained intervention was no longer explainable as ignorance. The McLean house was sold eventually, as the marriage moved toward its final configuration. What happened inside it during those years, and the specific texture of the days, the shape of the children's experience, the private arithmetic of a woman managing her own disappearance, is reconstructed primarily from retrospective accounts, because no one who was present at the time considered it the story worth documenting. The story worth documenting was always somewhere else. Ted Kennedy announced his candidacy for the Democratic presidential nomination in November 1979, challenging the incumbent Jimmy Carter in a move that the political press had been anticipating for months, and that the Kennedy operation had been preparing for considerably longer. The announcement was made at Faneuil Hall in Boston, a venue chosen with the deliberateness that the Kennedy political apparatus applied to all symbolic decisions. The crowd was large and enthusiastic. Joan was present in the front row in a red dress that had been selected for its visibility under television lighting. She had agreed to participate in the campaign. This is documented, and it is worth examining what that agreement represented at the end of 1979. Joan Kennedy was 43 years old. She had been through multiple hospitalizations. She was in a marriage that had long since ceased to function as anything other than a political arrangement. She was in therapy, one of the few sustained forms of support she had maintained through the late 1970s. And her therapist, by Joan's own account, had expressed reservations about whether a presidential campaign was a reasonable environment for a woman in her condition. Joan participated anyway. The reasons she gave in interviews conducted during and after the campaign shifted depending on when they were asked and what she was willing to say. She believed in Ted's candidacy. She wanted to be useful. She felt she had no real choice. These explanations are not mutually exclusive, and the most honest account of her participation probably contains elements of all three, organized in a proportion that Joan herself may not have been able to specify precisely. The campaign made specific use of her in a way that the 1970 Senate race had prefigured, but that the presidential scale amplified considerably. Joan was assigned her own schedule of appearances, her own press operation, her own campaign staff whose primary function was managing her visibility and her condition simultaneously. She gave interviews, more than she had ever given during any previous campaign, in which she spoke about her alcoholism with a directness that was, by the standards of 1979 and 1980, remarkable. She named it. She described it as a disease. She spoke about her treatment and her sobriety with a candor that no public figure of her prominence had applied to the subject in that era. These interviews were politically useful. This is not a cynical observation, it is a factual one, and Joan understood it. A candidate whose marriage had been publicly troubled, whose wife's alcoholism was an open secret in Washington, needed a narrative that converted liability into something more manageable. Joan's public honesty about her condition converted it into a story about courage and recovery, which was a more useful story for the campaign than the alternative. She was aware of this calculus. She participated in it deliberately, which was its own form of sophistication, using the campaign's need for her to create a public space for something that had previously been managed only through silence. The primary campaign was difficult from the beginning. Carter was an incumbent with the structural advantages that incumbency provides, and the Kennedy campaign struggled to articulate a clear rationale beyond the dynastic argument that the name itself was supposed to make. Ted gave a television interview to Roger Mudd in November 1979, before the formal announcement, in which he was asked the straightforward question of why he wanted to be president. His answer was famously incoherent, halting, circular, unable to land on anything resembling a clear statement of purpose. The interview was broadcast and widely discussed as a significant early wound to the campaign. Joan watched it. She did not speak publicly about her reaction. The campaign continued. She traveled extensively through the primary states, Iowa and New Hampshire. The southern states where the Kennedy name carried less inherited warmth and where Joan's personal charm was being deployed as a supplement to the political argument. She was sober during this period, or substantially so. Her staff was attentive. Her schedule was managed. The variables that had historically destabilized her were minimized to the extent that a presidential campaign allows for minimization, which is not very much. She was also, by the accounts of people who traveled with her, visibly tired in a way that the camera occasionally caught, and that the press occasionally noted without pursuing further. There was a moment in New Hampshire in February 1980, documented in the campaign press pool reports, where Joan arrived at an event in a small town and before entering the hall, stood for several minutes in the parking lot in the February cold, not moving, not speaking to the aide beside her, looking at a point somewhere beyond the building. The aide waited. After several minutes, Joan straightened her coat, turned toward the entrance, and went inside. She spoke at the event for 12 minutes. The speech was well received. What that pause in the parking lot contained is not recorded. It is a blank in the documentation, a moment where the available record simply runs out, and what was happening inside the woman, standing in the cold in New Hampshire in February, is not accessible through any account that was written down. It exists in the press pool report only as a timing note. The candidate's wife arrived at 7:14 and entered the building at 7:21. Ted Kennedy lost the Iowa caucuses to Carter in January 1980. He lost New Hampshire. He lost a succession of primaries through the spring, won some, and arrived at the Democratic National Convention in August, having failed to secure the nomination. His concession speech at the convention, delivered after Carter had secured the delegates, was widely considered the best speech of the campaign, possibly the best speech of his career. The crowd responded to it with the particular emotion that comes from watching someone articulate something that has already been lost. Joan sat in the convention hall and watched. She was in the camera frame periodically, composed, attentive, wearing the expression. The marriage, for all public purposes, was still the marriage. The campaign was over. The arrangement that the campaign had briefly restructured, giving Joan her own staff, her own schedule, her own purpose within the enterprise, was also over. What came next had no schedule, no press operation, and no political rationale to organize itself around. The formal announcement of Ted and Joan Kennedy's separation came in January 1981, 5 months after the convention, delivered through a joint statement that had been drafted with the care that the Kennedy operation applied to all public communications. The statement was brief. It described the separation as mutual and amicable. It expressed the couple's shared commitment to their children. It contained no explanation, no attribution of fault, and no language that invited further inquiry. It was, as a piece of public relations, nearly perfect, a document designed to close a subject rather than open one. The press received it with the restraint that the Kennedy name still commanded in 1981. There were stories, naturally. The separation of a former presidential candidate and his wife of 22 years was a news event regardless of how carefully it was packaged. But the coverage was largely confined to the facts. As stated, supplemented by the speculation that fills the space when official accounts are deliberately minimal. The affairs were discussed obliquely. Chappaquiddick was mentioned as background. Joan's alcoholism was described in the careful language of a condition she had been working to address. No one in the press with access to the Kennedy world wrote at the time anything that resembled the full account of what the marriage had been. Joan was 44 years old. She had been married for 22 years. She had 3 children, the youngest of whom was 17. She had been through multiple hospitalizations, a presidential campaign, the management of her own public image as a political instrument, and the private arithmetic of a marriage that had been a transaction from its earliest stages and had never fully become anything else. The divorce proceedings took place over the following year and were finalized in 1982. They were conducted in Virginia, managed by lawyers on both sides, who understood that the goal was resolution without public spectacle. Joan received a settlement that was described at the time as generous, a lump sum, a property arrangement, ongoing financial support. The specific figures were not disclosed publicly, and the non-disclosure was itself part of the settlement's architecture. Joan signed documents agreeing to terms that included, in various forms, the management of what she would say publicly about the marriage and about Ted. What she received in material terms was significant by most measures. What she received relative to what she had contributed: 22 years of managed appearances, sustained public performance, the deployment of her image as a political asset across multiple campaigns, the absorption of the family's public crises into her own body and life, is a different calculation, and not one the settlement process was designed to make. She moved to Boston. This was, in its way, a deliberate choice. Boston, rather than New York, rather than Washington, rather than anywhere that would have been a cleaner break from the geography of Kennedy life. Boston was Ted's city, politically, and it was the city where the Kennedy name carried its most immediate weight. Joan chose it anyway, perhaps because it was the city she knew, perhaps because proximity to the family's center was the only geography she could imagine, having spent 2 decades organized around it. She found a condominium on Beacon Hill, a neighborhood of federal-style brick buildings and narrow streets, expensive and quiet, the kind of place that provided privacy through density rather than seclusion. The condominium was well appointed. She furnished it herself as she had furnished every house she had lived in, carefully, with genuine attention to the space. People who visited described it as warm and particular, reflecting a taste that was genuinely hers rather than the managed aesthetic of a political household. She also, in the period immediately following the divorce, gave a series of interviews that were more candid than anything she had said publicly during the marriage. She discussed the alcoholism directly. She discussed the loneliness. She described the experience of being a Kennedy wife in terms that were careful but not entirely managed. There were edges in the language, places where the controlled register she had developed over decades showed strain. She said that she had lost herself inside the marriage. She said it was taking a long time to find out who she was. These were the most direct things she had said in public about her own experience, and they were received by the press and public of the early 1980s with the particular condescension that the era applied to women speaking about their own interior lives. We sympathetically, but as personal revelation rather than as anything requiring structural examination. The Kennedy family's response to the divorce was, characteristically, managed through silence. There was no public statement from Ted beyond the joint announcement. Rose Kennedy, then in her 90s and in declining health, made no recorded comment. The family closed around Ted in the way it closed around all difficulties, efficiently, without ceremony. The protective formation so practiced by this point as to be nearly automatic. Joan's relationship with her children in this period was complicated in ways that the divorce did not create, but sharpened. Kara was 21, beginning her adult life. Teddy Jr. was 20, navigating his own early recovery from cancer in his father's career. Patrick was 17, and in the period of difficulty that would intensify through his adolescence. All three had grown up in the specific environment that the McLean years had produced, a household with a largely absent father and a mother whose presence had been inconsistent in ways that the children registered differently, but that all three, in their adult accounts, described as formative. In the particular sense that things formative in the sense of leaving marks. The divorce did not resolve Joan's alcoholism. This is the fact that the early 1980s interviews, with their language of recovery and new beginnings, somewhat obscured. Sobriety during the campaign had been maintained through external structure, staff, schedule, accountability, imposed from outside. The divorce removed the campaign. It did not replace the structure with anything equivalent. Joan was living alone on Beacon Hill with the material comfort the settlement had provided and the interior resources that decades of managed performance had not developed. The condominium was quiet. The Beacon Hill streets were quiet at the hours she kept. The Kennedy name was still present in the city's political life, in the newspapers, in the social geography of a place that had organized itself around that family for decades. She was in it, and no longer entirely of it, and the distance between those two positions had no map. The New England Conservatory of Music sits on Huntington Avenue in Boston's Fenway neighborhood, a Romanesque building of considerable gravity that has, since its founding in 1867, operated on the premise that serious music requires serious commitment. Joan Kennedy had begun her studies there in the mid-1970s, attending classes during the periods when the McLean household and the demands of Ted's Senate career left intervals that were hers to fill. After the divorce, she returned to complete her degree, not as a dabbler, not as a prominent woman pursuing a cultivated hobby, but as a student who attended classes, practiced with regularity, and submitted to the evaluations that the institution applied to everyone, regardless of who they were outside its walls. She completed her master's degree in music education in 1985. The degree was real, earned through years of interrupted study and genuine musical ability that her instructors consistently described as more than ceremonial. There was a graduation. She attended it. Photographs from the ceremony show her in academic robes, holding the degree, smiling in a way that is distinguishable from the campaign smile, less constructed, the expression of someone who has completed something that belonged to her rather than something she was performing for someone else. The degree did not become a career. This is the fact that follows the ceremony, and it is the fact that the accounts of this period tend to soften or skip past because it is uncomfortable in the specific way that potential unrealized is uncomfortable. Joan had the degree, the talent, and the time. She did not find a sustained professional application for any of them. She gave occasional lectures. She spoke at events about music education, about her own musical development, in the measured and pleasant register she had never entirely abandoned. But the conservatory credential did not translate into the kind of purposeful daily structure that might have organized the years that followed. The Beacon Hill condominium was where she spent most of her time. She was known in the neighborhood, not intrusively, not as a celebrity in the way that the Kennedy name might have generated in a more public-facing city, but as a familiar figure on certain streets, in certain shops, at certain hours. Neighbors described her as pleasant and somewhat solitary. She walked. She attended concerts at Symphony Hall, a short distance away. She maintained the apartment with the careful attention she had always brought to domestic spaces. She also drank. The sobriety of the campaign years and the early divorce period had not held. By the mid-1980s, the pattern that had been established in the McLean years had reasserted itself in the Beacon Hill apartment, in the absence of the external structures, staff, schedule, political accountability, that had periodically interrupted it. There was no campaign to be sober for. There was no press operation monitoring her condition. There was the apartment and the hours and the particular freedom of a life with no public obligations that was also, in its way, a particular kind of trap. Her children were adults now, or becoming adults, and their relationships were shaped by the history of the McLean years in ways that none of them had the tools in the 1980s to address directly. Kara was living her own life, establishing herself professionally, maintaining contact with her mother that was described by people close to the family as careful, loving but careful, the carefulness of someone who has learned to calibrate her expectations. Teddy Jr. was in early adulthood, dealing with the aftermath of his illness and his father's career, navigating a public identity that was largely defined by a name he had not chosen. Patrick was the most troubled of the three, struggling with addiction and anxiety in ways that would become more public as he moved toward his own political career in Rhode Island. The parallel between Joan's condition and Patrick's was not discussed publicly during this period. It existed, visibly, for anyone paying attention, a mother and her youngest child both managing addiction, both doing so largely without the other, the similarity too close and too painful for the family's emotional vocabulary to accommodate directly. Joan gave an interview in 1985, the year of the conservatory degree, to a journalist who described her, in the published piece, as alternately lucid and distant during their conversation. The journalist noted that Joan had spoken articulately about her music studies, and then, when the conversation shifted toward her current daily life, had become vaguer, the responses shorter, the specific quality of her attention changing in a way the journalist recorded without fully interpreting. The article ran with a photograph of Joan at a piano, which was the image the magazine wanted, and which told the story the magazine had decided to tell. There were people in Joan's life during this period, friends, a therapist she saw intermittently, the occasional family member, but the social fabric was thin in the way that the social fabrics of people managing addiction tend to become thin. Relationships require consistency and reciprocity, and both are difficult to maintain when a person's availability is as variable as Joan's had become. The friends who remained were the ones who had adjusted their expectations, who had learned to accept the version of Joan that was available on any given day without requiring it to be the same version as the day before. She appeared periodically in the press, a sighting, a brief item in a Boston column, an occasional photograph at a public event. These appearances were always noted with the same slightly elegiac quality that the press had adopted for Joan Kennedy by the mid-1980s. The tone of a story that was understood to have reached its conclusion and was now simply being monitored for its final chapter. She was described as doing well, or as looking well, or as seeming well. All of those words doing the same work that exciting and lovely and overwhelming had done throughout her life, signifying nothing specific about what was actually true. The Kennedy family continued in its public life around her. Ted remained in the Senate, accumulating the legislative record that would eventually define his legacy. The Kennedy name remained a gravitational force in Massachusetts and national politics. Joan existed at the edge of all of it, connected by name, by her children, by the 22 years of marriage that the divorce had ended but not erased. And the edge was where she remained. The conservatory degree hung on a wall in the Beacon Hill apartment. Whether it was visible from where she usually sat is not recorded. Cara Kennedy was 31 years old in 1991 when she was diagnosed with lung cancer. She had been a smoker, which the diagnosis made relevant in the way that medical facts become relevant, suddenly, retroactively, as though the behavior had been working toward this outcome all along. She underwent surgery and treatment, survived, and would live another 20 years before dying of a heart attack in 2011 at the age of 51. During the 1991 diagnosis and its aftermath, Joan was present in the ways that she could be: phone calls, visits, the gestures of maternal concern that her condition permitted. The accounts of this period describe a mother who was frightened and loving and not entirely reliable, which is a combination that Cara had learned over the course of her adult life to accommodate. Cara's relationship with Joan in the years following the divorce was the most functional of the three children's relationships with their mother, which is not to say it was without difficulty. Cara had developed, through what appeared to be a combination of temperament and deliberate effort, a form of emotional pragmatism about her parents. She maintained contact with both, navigated the Kennedy family's social geography with more ease than either of her brothers, and had constructed an adult identity that was recognizably her own rather than simply a function of the name she carried. She worked in television production for a period, then in advocacy, co-founding a mental health organization with her father that bore the Kennedy name and the Kennedy family's characteristic combination of genuine commitment and public utility. That Joan was not a visible part of this advocacy work that touched directly on the mental health and addiction issues that had defined her own adult life, is one of the quieter ironies of this period. The Kennedy family's engagement with mental health causes was real and produced measurable results. Joan's lived experience of the conditions those causes addressed was more extensive than almost anyone else in the family. The two things did not connect in any documented way. Teddy Jr.'s relationship with his mother during the 1980s and 1990s was shaped by the specific complexity of a child who had been close to her during his illness and had watched, through his adolescence and early adulthood, the progression of her alcoholism from something frightening into something chronic. He had his father's physical confidence and something of his mother's sensitivity, a combination that manifested in his early life as a particular vulnerability to the emotional weather of the household he had grown up in. He struggled with his own substance use in early adulthood, recovered, and became an environmental lawyer and activist, building a life that was purposeful and publicly engaged in ways that his father's legacy supported and his own effort sustained. His adult accounts of Joan are among the most careful in the documentary record. Loving without being protective of the facts, honest about the difficulties without converting them into grievance. He described a mother who had been present during his illness with a completeness she was not always able to manage at other times. He described the inconsistency as painful without describing it as defining. This carefulness reads as the product of considerable internal work, the language of someone who has spent time in therapy. Making sense of a childhood that did not organize itself into simple narratives. Patrick Kennedy's trajectory through these years was the most publicly documented and the most directly parallel to Joan's own. He was elected to the Rhode Island State Legislature in 1988 at the age of 20, the youngest Kennedy to hold elected office, and to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1994. He was also, through much of this period, managing addiction, to alcohol, to prescription drugs, to the particular cocktail of substances that his anxiety and his depression and his family history made available to him as management tools. His 2006 car accident on Capitol Hill, which occurred in the early morning hours and raised questions about his condition at the time, was handled with a public directness that was, in its way, a departure from the Kennedy family's historical approach to such matters. Patrick checked himself into treatment and spoke about his addiction publicly. Joan watched this from Boston. What she felt about her youngest child's public reckoning with a condition she had been managing privately for decades is not documented in any detail. She did not speak about it publicly. She did not appear beside Patrick in the way that a mother's presence might have been expected or deployed. The parallel? Mother and son, addiction, the Kennedy name, the same mechanisms of management and concealment and eventual disclosure, was visible to anyone looking and apparently unspoken between them in any recorded form. The three children had, by the 1990s, developed their individual strategies for maintaining a relationship with a mother whose availability was inconsistent and whose condition was chronic. These strategies shared certain features: the calibrated expectation, the adjusted definition of presence, the particular emotional labor of loving someone whose capacity to receive love varies day to day. They also differed in ways that reflected their individual temperaments and the different experiences they had each had of the McLean years and the divorce. None of them, in the accounts available, described Joan as absent in the way that genuine abandonment reads. She was present, in phone calls, in visits, in the gestures of maternal attention that her condition permitted. But presence at reduced capacity, maintained over decades, produces its own kind of distance. Not the distance of someone who has left, but the distance of someone who is there and not entirely reachable, which is in some ways harder to name and harder to grieve. Joan's relationship with Ted during this period was mediated almost entirely through the children. Logistical communications, the occasional family event, the geography of a divorce that had ended the marriage without ending the shared terrain of parenthood. Ted had remarried in 1992, wedding Victoria Reggie, in a small ceremony that was reported in the press with the same brief item treatment that the Kennedy family's preference for managed information produced. Joan did not comment publicly on the remarriage. She sent a gift. This detail appears in a single account, sourced to someone close to Joan at the time, and its accuracy cannot be fully verified. Whether it is precisely true or not, it has the quality of something that could be. The gesture of a woman who had spent her adult life producing the appropriate response to situations that were not appropriate, maintaining the form of social behavior long after the circumstances that the form was designed to address had changed entirely. Boston in April is a city in negotiation with itself, the winter releasing its grip slowly, reluctantly, the cold persisting in the shade of buildings, while the sun on open pavements suggests something warmer is coming. The streets of Beacon Hill in that season are narrow and uneven, the brick sidewalks heaved by decades of frost and thaw, the kind of surface that requires attention even from people who are steady on their feet. On April 20th, 2012, Joan Kennedy was found on a Beacon Hill sidewalk, having fallen. She was 75 years old. She had injured herself, a broken shoulder, injuries to her face, and was taken to Massachusetts General Hospital, where she was treated and kept for observation. The fall was reported in the Boston press within days, and the reporting carried the same slightly elegiac tone that coverage of Joan had carried for decades. The concerned register of people documenting a conclusion they have long anticipated. The circumstances of the fall were not fully established publicly. Whether she had been drinking, whether a medical episode had contributed, whether the uneven brick surface of Beacon Hill had simply done what uneven brick surfaces do to people in their 70s. These questions circulated in the press and among people who knew her without receiving definitive answers. What was established was that she had been alone, that she had been on the street rather than in her apartment, and that no one had been with her when it happened. This last fact, that she had been alone, was the one that the coverage returned to most consistently, because it was the fact that opened onto everything else. A woman of Joan Kennedy's social position, with her family connections and financial resources, found injured and alone on a public sidewalk at 75 was a story that the available facts could not entirely contain. The press wrote around the edges of what the image implied without fully stating it, because fully stating it would have required a directness that the coverage of Joan Kennedy had never managed to sustain. Her children responded quickly. Kara, Teddy Jr., and Patrick were all in contact in the days following the fall, and the family's response, coordinated, concerned, moving toward a practical resolution, was more organized than the years preceding the fall might have suggested. This was partly a function of the specificity of crisis. A fall, a hospital, a broken shoulder are concrete problems that generate concrete responses, and the Kennedy family had always been more capable of responding to concrete problems than to the ambient chronic difficulties that had characterized Joan's situation for decades. The fall also forced into public view something that people close to Joan had been observing for years, that she was not managing well alone, that the Beacon Hill apartment had become an environment in which her safety was not reliably assured, and that the structures that might have addressed this had not been put in place. Friends described a woman who had been increasingly isolated in the years before the fall. The social fabric, already thin by the 1980s, had continued to thin through the 1990s and 2000s as the people around her adjusted to a version of Joan that was less and less available, and as Joan herself retreated further into the apartment and the hours it contained. The drinking had continued through all of it. This is documented in the medical records that became partially visible through the subsequent legal proceedings and in the accounts of people who had maintained contact with her through the 2000s. Joan had been through additional treatment programs. There had been hospitalizations in the 1990s, periods of sobriety that held for months and then did not, the pattern established in the 1960s still running its course decades later. The consistency of the pattern across 50 years of her life is one of the documentary record's most difficult features. Not because addiction is surprising, but because the consistency demonstrates how completely the conditions that had produced the drinking had never been adequately addressed. The fall generated a medical and legal process that moved relatively quickly by the standards of such things. Joan was discharged from Massachusetts General and returned to the Beacon Hill apartment, but the question of her ongoing care had been made urgent in a way it had not been before. Her children were involved. Lawyers were involved. The Kennedy family, which had managed Joan's condition through silence and discretion for decades, was now managing it through the more formal mechanisms that the fall had made necessary. What emerged from this process was a picture of Joan's daily life in the years before the fall that was more detailed and more difficult than what had been publicly visible. She had been drinking heavily and regularly. She had been falling. The April incident was not the first, but it was the most serious and the most public. She had been, by the accounts of people who had seen her in the preceding months, in a condition that required care she was not receiving, and that she was not, in her current state, capable of securing for herself. The medical and legal record from this period also reveals something about the years of the divorce settlement and the Beacon Hill life that the settlement had funded, that the financial resources provided had been adequate to maintain the apartment and the material structure of Joan's life, but had not been configured in any sustained way to address the condition that was most directly threatening her. Money had paid for the apartment. It had not paid for the ongoing, sustained, individualized care that her situation required, because that kind of care requires more than money. It requires the sustained attention of people who understand what they are dealing with and are committed to addressing it over years, rather than crisis by crisis. The 2012 fall was covered internationally. Briefly, because Joan Kennedy's name still carried that reach, and briefly because the coverage of her life had long since settled into a register that did not sustain extended examination. She was a footnote to a famous name, and the fall was a footnote to a footnote, reported and then filed into the archive of things that had happened to people who were adjacent to history rather than inside it. Ted Kennedy had died in August 2009 of brain cancer at the age of 77. Joan had not attended the funeral services in a prominent capacity. She was present at some of the related events, photographed at the edges of the gatherings, in the configuration she had occupied for 60 years. Present, peripheral, and mostly looking at a point just past the center of whatever was happening. The fall had happened. The hospital had treated the shoulder. The legal process had begun its work. The legal process that began in the aftermath of the 2012 fall moved through the Massachusetts court system with the procedural steadiness that such matters require. Guardianship proceedings. The legal mechanism by which a court determines that an individual lacks the capacity to make decisions about their own life and assigns that authority to another person or institution are not unusual in cases involving elderly individuals with documented histories of impairment. They are, however, rarely applied to people of Joan Kennedy's social prominence, and the proceedings generated a quiet attention in the Boston legal and social community that the family's preference for privacy could not entirely suppress. The guardianship was established in 2009, 3 years before the fall, a timeline that complicates the narrative of the April 2012 incident as a catalyst. The legal process had already determined, before Joan was found injured on the Beacon Hill sidewalk, that she required a guardian to manage certain aspects of her affairs. The fall made this determination more publicly visible, but the determination itself had been made earlier, through a process that Joan's family and lawyers had initiated with the practical logic of people who had been watching a situation deteriorate for years and had finally reached the point where informal management was no longer adequate. What guardianship means, in practical terms, is the formal removal of legal autonomy. A person under guardianship cannot make binding decisions about their finances, their medical care, their living arrangements, or other significant aspects of their life without the consent and oversight of their appointed guardian. The law frames this as protection, and in cases where an individual genuinely lacks the capacity to protect themselves, it functions as exactly that. It is also simultaneously the legal acknowledgement that a person has lost the standing to determine the shape of their own existence. Joan Kennedy had spent her adult life having the shape of her existence determined by forces outside herself, by the Kennedy family's requirements, by Ted's political career, by the campaign operations that had deployed her image, by the settlement that had defined the terms of her post-marriage life. The guardianship was, in this sense, continuous with the structure of her life rather than a departure from it. The mechanism was different, legal rather than social, formal rather than ambient. But the effect was familiar. Someone else held the authority. Her son, Ted Jr., was involved in the guardianship arrangements, as were lawyers and professional guardians, whose specific roles shifted over time as Joan's condition and circumstances changed. The proceedings were handled with the discretion that Massachusetts probate court allows and that the Kennedy family reliably pursued, and the details that became publicly available were those that the process required to be public, rather than those that any party would have chosen to disclose. Joan remained in the Beacon Hill apartment for a period following the establishment of guardianship, with additional care structures put in place. Caregivers, more regular oversight, the practical scaffolding that the court's determination required. This arrangement was, by the accounts available, better than what had preceded it in the sense that Joan was less isolated and more consistently monitored. Whether it was better in any other sense, whether it produced anything that resembled comfort or dignity, or the feeling of being cared for by people who understood her, is not a question the available record answers. The apartment itself became a subject of the legal proceedings. Its maintenance, its costs, the question of whether it remained an appropriate environment, these were managed through the guardianship structure, with the practical efficiency that legal mechanisms produce and that human experience does not always accommodate. Joan had furnished the Beacon Hill apartment herself, had lived in it for more than 3 decades, had made it the one space in her post-Kennedy life that was genuinely hers. The legal process treated it as a variable in a care equation, which it was, and as nothing else, which it was also not. There were, during the guardianship years, public appearances, fewer, more carefully managed, but present. Joan attended events connected to the Kennedy family's ongoing public life. She was photographed at the dedication of the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate in Boston in 2015, a large formal event that gathered the Kennedy family and the Massachusetts political establishment in one room to honor Ted's legacy. Joan appears in photographs from that day at the edges of the gathering, in the configuration she had occupied at such events for 6 decades. She is well dressed. Her expression is composed. She looks in the photographs somewhat smaller than she had looked in the earlier images. Not dramatically, but perceptibly, the specific diminishment that years produce in a body that has been through what hers had been through. The Institute itself, a substantial building adjacent to the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library on Columbia Point, dedicated to civic education and the legislative process, was the kind of legacy monument that the Kennedy family built with the same deliberateness it applied to all its public projects. Ted Kennedy's name on the building, his record inscribed in its exhibitions, his biography made institutional and permanent. Joan's connection to that legacy, as the woman who had been married to the man for 22 years, who had contributed the public image that multiple campaigns had required, who had absorbed the private costs that the public career had generated, was not a feature of the Institute's architecture or its programming. She had not been asked to contribute to it in any documented way. She was present at the dedication as a former wife, a category with a specific social location acknowledged and peripheral, present in the photographs and absent from the narrative the building was designed to tell. The guardianship years were also the years in which Joan's public image underwent a quiet shift in how it was described. The press coverage from this period, obituary pre-writes, anniversary pieces about the Kennedy family, occasional sightings, described her increasingly in the past tense, or in a present tense so carefully hedged as to function like a past tense. She had been this. She had done that. The language of active personhood was replaced gradually by the language of archive. She was alive. She was in Boston. She was under guardianship in an apartment she had chosen and could no longer fully control, in a city organized around a name that had defined her without belonging to her, surrounded by the material evidence of a life whose shape had been determined at almost every significant point by someone other than herself. The legal authority to make decisions about Joan Kennedy's life resided formally with her guardian. It had resided informally with others for considerably longer than that. Joan Bennett Kennedy died on January 27, 2024, at the age of 87. The announcement was made by her children, Teddy Jr., Patrick, and Kara's family, Kara herself having died in 2011, in a statement that was brief and warm and contained the specific language of family grief managed for public consumption. She was described as beloved. Her love of music was mentioned. Her beauty was mentioned. The statement did not mention the alcoholism, the guardianship, the decades of managed isolation, or the particular shape of the life that had preceded the death. It was, as a document, a final act of the same management that had characterized the public presentation of Joan Kennedy for 60 years. The obituaries that followed were more expansive, but operated within a similar set of constraints. The constraints of a story that had always been told in relation to someone else. The New York Times obituary described her primarily in terms of her marriage to Ted Kennedy, the Chappaquiddick aftermath, her public acknowledgement of alcoholism during the 1980 campaign. The Associated Press framing was similar. She was the Kennedy wife. She was the forgotten Kennedy. She was described in several pieces as tragic, a word applied with the confidence of people who understood what they meant by it and the imprecision of people who had not fully examined it. Tragic, as it was applied to Joan Kennedy in January 2024, meant beautiful and wasted. It meant potential unrealized. It meant a woman who had been caught in circumstances larger than herself and had not escaped them. This is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete. It locates the tragedy in Joan's failure to transcend her circumstances, rather than in the circumstances themselves, which is a subtle but significant distinction that the obituary form, with its preference for individual narrative over structural examination, is not well designed to make. The music was mentioned in almost every obituary, and in almost every obituary it was mentioned in the same way, as evidence of depth beneath the surface, as the real Joan glimpsed beneath the political wife. This framing, repeated across dozens of publications in the days following her death, carries its own irony, that the most consistent evidence of Joan Kennedy's interior life was an accomplishment she had been developing since before she met Ted Kennedy, that it had survived the marriage and the compound, and the campaigns and the hospitalizations and the guardianship, and that it was understood in death primarily as a contrast to everything the marriage had required her to suppress. Her children's statements were genuine in their grief and notable in their restraint. Teddy Jr. spoke about her warmth and her love of music. Patrick, who had spent his adult life speaking publicly about addiction and mental health with a directness that his mother had never been permitted or able to sustain, said that she had been a devoted mother. The word devoted is doing considerable work in that sentence. It is true in the way that most things said at such moments are true, which is partially at the edges, in the spaces where what is meant and what is accurate do not fully overlap. The Kennedy Institute on Columbia Point did not, in the immediate aftermath of Joan's death, announce any commemorative programming or permanent acknowledgement of her connection to the institution that bore her former husband's name. This is not surprising and does not require elaboration. It is simply a fact about what institutions built around powerful men tend to contain and what they tend not to. The Beacon Hill apartment, the condominium she had chosen and furnished and lived in for more than 3 decades, was, by the time of her death, no longer hers in any legal sense. The guardianship had transferred the authority over it. What happened to its contents, the furniture she had selected, the conservatory degree on the wall, the accumulated objects of a life lived in deliberate and careful attention to domestic space, is not documented in the public record. There were memorial masses, the Kennedy family's Catholic practice providing the liturgical structure for public grief that it had provided for decades, across the deaths of brothers and children, and finally Ted himself. Joan's Mass was attended by family and friends, reported briefly, and passed from the news cycle within days. The brevity was not malicious. It was simply the arithmetic of attention applied to a woman who had always existed at the edge of the stories being told about the people she was connected to. What the historical record of Joan Kennedy's life contains, assembled from the biographies and the press accounts and the court documents and the interviews she gave across 6 decades, is a detailed portrait of a particular kind of erasure. Not the erasure of a woman who was absent from the historical record, but of one who was thoroughly present in it and thoroughly misread. She appears in thousands of photographs. She gave hundreds of interviews. She was covered, written about, observed, and discussed for 60 years. And the cumulative effect of all that documentation is a portrait of a woman seen almost entirely from the outside, in the configurations that the Kennedy operation required, at the distances that the family's preference for managed information maintained. The piano she had played since childhood, the instrument that her instructors at Manhattanville and the New England Conservatory had agreed represented genuine ability rather than ornamental accomplishment, is not mentioned in the public record after the early years of her time on Beacon Hill. Whether she continued to play through the guardianship years, whether the music that had been hers alone since before the marriage remained available to her in the apartment's final configuration, is not known. This is not a small gap in the record. It is, in some ways, the central one. The question of whether the thing that had always been most fully hers, that had survived everything the Kennedy years had required of her, was still present at the end. The record does not answer it. The record, which had always been more interested in the marriage than in the woman, stops where it always stopped. At the edge of what Joan Kennedy actually experienced, looking in from the outside, recording the surface with considerable thoroughness, and the interior with almost none. She had been beautiful. She had been photographed. She had stood at the correct distance from the microphone for 60 years. What she heard in the silence after the music stopped belongs to no archive. Return for a moment to the autumn of 1962, the rally in Massachusetts. The crowd facing Ted Kennedy at the microphone, Joan standing slightly behind and to the right, in the wool coat the color of winter wheat, holding the expression that reads, "From a distance," as pride. 3 of the photographs from that afternoon show her present. In 2, she is partially obscured. In the 3rd, she is fully visible. Standing alone in the frame, while the men around her face another direction. She is 26 years old in that photograph. She has been married 4 years. She has miscarried once. She has spent 4 summers at the compound learning the rules of a place that was not designed to teach them. She is pregnant, though this may not yet be visible in the wool coat. She will miscarry again. She will stand in dozens of photographs that look almost exactly like this one, in different coats, in different cities across the next 2 decades. None of this is visible in the photograph. What is visible is the smile, the posture, the accomplished stillness of a woman who has learned to make absence look like composure. The question that Joan Kennedy's life leaves open is not whether the Kennedy family failed her. It did in ways that are documented and specific and not seriously in dispute. The question is what kind of failure it was, whether it was the failure of particular people making particular choices, which is the story that individual biography tends to tell, or whether it was the failure of an entire set of arrangements. the social world that produced her in Bronxville, the institution that refined her at Manhattanville, the family that absorbed her at Hyannisport, the political operation that deployed her across Massachusetts and the country. Arrangements so thoroughly constructed around the assumption that a woman like Joan existed in relation to other people's purposes that the question of her own never became urgent until it was too late to answer cleanly. She named her alcoholism publicly in 1980, at a time when no public figure of her prominence had done so. She completed a graduate degree in music in 1985 alone, at an institution that did not know or care whose wife she had been. She lived for more than 30 years after the divorce in an apartment she chose and furnished herself, on streets she walked at hours of her own choosing, which was more autonomy than she had exercised at any point during the marriage. These facts exist alongside the other facts. They do not resolve them. What wealth provided Joan Kennedy was the material structure of a life, the houses, the staff, the settlement, the Beacon Hill apartment, without the interior architecture that might have made that structure habitable. What the Kennedy name provided was visibility without legibility. She was seen, constantly, by people who were looking at something else. The photograph from 1962 yellows in the archive, the way newsprint does. The smile remains accomplished. The expression gives nothing away. Somewhere behind it, a woman is standing in a room full of people, alone in the specific way that no one around her appears to notice, holding still for a camera that is pointed, more or less, in her direction.